Pastor Casper here. Let's learn every hymn. Well, today we're not actually going to learn a hymn. We're going to talk instead about the distribution of human voices. I'm going to try to quickly cover how it is that human voice distribution works and why parts writing is a certain way, and why melodies are predominantly a little too low relative to where they ought to be. But we'll get to that in a second. So first we need to establish what it is that gives us the brackets of human voices and where the distribution works. There's a bell curve. A whole bunch of people in the middle and a few people on the extreme ends of both sides. That bell curve delivers us what the distribution of human voices is. However, when it comes to singing and parts writing, we write parts in 4 parts, not in 6 or more. So instead of having a center part that's right in the middle of the bell curve, we write parts by displacing someone a little bit higher and a little bit lower relative to their most comfortable zone, and everybody tends to lean one way or the other, and so you pick the one that is the most comfortable for you, and that's the direction you go. Everyone is displaced a little bit relative to the most central distribution of voices. So let's take a look at where these bell curves are and what they look like. Men and women both have the same distribution. By the way, there are only men and women, so we won't talk about anything else. Okay. Here are a pair of extremely rudimentary bell curves. This identifies the voice distribution of women, this identifies the voice distribution of men. Now, there are some cool indicators to help us identify where these things exist in space. The target notes for extremely excellent singers that are high-voiced women, high-voiced men, high-voiced, low-voiced women, low-voiced men are very similar. So we will call this the C target zone. Middle C in the center of the piano is often identified as C5. C5 tells us that that's the center point in the notes. That's also the center of the musical score, and I'll draw one of those in a second too. But this identifies the middlest of Cs. The target note for tenors, which is what I am, is going to be 1 octave above C5 middle C. Add 1, we get to C6. C6 is the upper end target for high-performing tenor-voiced men singers. For men who are basses, high-performing, the target note for them on the bottom is also a C. It's 2 below C5 middle C, so that's actually going to be C3. Not to be confused with the robot from Star Wars. In any case, and there's not enough letters there anyway. So we get the similar thing going on with women. For high-performing alto singers, a target note for them is going to be 1 octave below middle C. That's going to put us at a C4 as an alto target. And again, for high-performing sopranos, a target note is going to be 2 octaves above C5, which is going to get us into C7 territory. Now, all this is to give us some parameters so that we can find some important things. The things we want to find are what are the brackets containing the middle? Again, C's are going to be helpful here. What this helps us to identify is that the middle area, the middle area for men's and women's voices are the octave above and below middle C. For women, it is the octave between middle C and C in the upper portion of the treble staff. In the case of men, it's going to be middle C down to the C on the bass clef staff. These 2 bracket zones identify where most of the voices are distributed within the general human parameters. That doesn't mean they can only sing in these notes. That just identifies where the central portion of their voice is. And there's actually a center in the middle of all of that. If you go from C to C, and what we're going to do at this point is we're going to disregard the men altogether. We're going to focus only on the women. If you go from C to C, you'll find another central point. That note right in the middle, the tritone between C and C is, interestingly enough, F sharp, and it's F sharp in the 5th octave, because we count from C and go up. All of the notes following that, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, those are all within the 5th octave before we get to C and pivot now to the 6th octave. So it's C5 for the women. It's going to be C6 or C4 for the men on that lower end, but we're going to focus right here now. So this distribution tells us that the voices have a center point and some general parameters, and that means that writing parts, we ought to be writing melody and harmony that are displaced away from that center. The melody should be higher than center, the harmony should be lower than center, and they ought to be roughly equidistant. If the melody and harmony are both distributed lower on the total range, what we find is, and this is where the misnomer comes in, more people can sing this melody. That may be true, but what we've also done is we've taken away the likelihood that folks can sing the harmony and actually have it in their comfortable range. We lose the purpose of 4-part writing, which is not only that the harmonization is clear and precise and simple, but also that people can sing. The idea behind 4-part writing in hymnody is that everyone should be able to sing a little bit. And you get a few folks who know how to sing a little bit, they can read a little bit of music, they can actually make their way through the hymnal and sing all 4 of the parts without having an accompanist there. When the melodies are low, when everything is pitched down, it gets harder to do that. Now, on the grand staff, identifying voices here, what we find, middle C, right in between the upper and lower staff, identifying that center point between men's and women's voices that isn't really the center point for anybody. The center points are F sharp and F sharp above and below. F sharp 4 and F sharp 5 identify where our parts are, which means our melody lines ought to be there and above. Our alto harmony lines there and below. Our tenor harmony lines there and above. And our bass harmony lines there and below. Now, when I'm identifying these zones, I'm not saying that the parts can only be above or below these lines. I'm saying the general center of the average of pitches ought to exist in this area. So if the pitches are starting lower and going higher, as all the notes combine together, the average ought to be above F sharp. The average ought to be below F sharp, above F sharp, below F sharp. So that's how we ought to look at this. That will dictate where the melody line goes. And what we're probably going to find, and we look at this more in the future, is that oftentimes the melody line of a hymn, because of the distribution of all of the parts, the melody line is not as high as it ought to be. It ought to be a little higher. Again, this discussion is going to go, well, we want everyone to sing the melody. There are 2 problems with that notion. One is that the melody is supposed to be above the comfortable range of the exact center of the bell curve. It needs to be higher than that. The other part is that you don't have to teach people to drop an octave when they're singing. When you're singing with small children and something gets too high for them, no one ever has to tell them how to drop the octave and sing down below 1 octave lower. If we're singing too high for the little kids, if we're singing a Christmas hymn, Christ the Lord is risen today, hallelujah. That's too high. you'll get this. Christ the Lord is risen today. Alleluia. No one ever has to tell them to do that. In general, you'll find that men sometimes think their voices are lower than they are. Having a melody and range that's pitched up higher will keep them from trying to sing off the staff and out of anyone's range. That's another thing that this helps to address. So there are quite a few various issues, but all these things can be discussed at another time. I just wanted to kind of broach the topic first about the idea that there is an average center and how that ought to play in the way that we write hymnody.